Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Good evening, everybody. I trust everyone is doing well. If you live up here in the Northeast, we've had quite a little bit of a snow and ice storm up here with cold temperatures, but it's going to warm up the next couple of days and rain, so hopefully, so far it's been a pretty easy winter and it'll continue that way, but you never know. If you have a comment about tonight's show or want to pitch in with any of your insights, we would certainly appreciate it. The number here is 515-604-9344. You'll be prompted to an access code of 914121#. Again, number here is 515-604-9344, and the access code is 914121#. Tonight's show, we're going to talk about a topic I guess you have probably heard, if not witnessed yourself, with the Catholic school at Covington and, what transpired over the weekend with the pro-life march in Washington. So you can see that this was quite a bit of a controversial subject, and there's a lot of things that we can glean from this. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about what happened here. The school kids were caught on video in front of a Native American who said he was a Vietnam veteran, banging his drum and singing some of their spiritual songs. And right away, what happened was this video, I guess the term is, went viral, and they were accused of racism and all kinds of things, all kinds of people from Hollywood, even in our own Catholic Church, the school itself. Again, I mentioned the entertainers, the media, they all condemned the kids. They were guilty until proven innocent. The same thing we've been witnessing in the country for a couple of years here, not longer. And as it turns out, we find a completely different story when the facts come out. And that's what's interesting about everything, is that we tend now to be a society that bases its decisions, that bases its morality, that bases its ideas, and are easily manipulated to think, say, what we mimic and copy through the media, whether it be social media or the entertainment industry itself. So the key here is that we don't wait, back off, and examine facts. And that's very unfortunate because you can see where our society is going. Now, the points that we can learn here, and we see there's a comparison here which just happened a few months ago with Justice Kavanaugh, the attacks on his character, and what turned out, that some of the women weren't quite on the up and up that were making these accusations. We see this time and again, and you see these two sides battling out, and always at the bottom line of this is this lust for power. So these kids falsely accused, threatened. We see that the videos then actually, when more facts came out, and we'll talk about that a little later, there was some racial things involved, but it was on the other side. And we'll get there. But let's start. Throughout, give or take, 242 years of the red, white, and blue here in America, and our freedom from Britain, and the wonderful thing that the Founding Fathers incorporated here with our Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, we've had freedom of expression and speech that has been at least officially part of the American civil discourse. Now, the key here is that we've got to realize, and this certainly isn't a shot at any of our brothers and sisters in any other Protestant faith or anything like that, but for the most part, we've seen the Christian country was Protestant here in America. But at least, the thing is, Christian is the key. We were Christian. And now it's very easy to see that we're a post-Christian society. And so what I'm getting at is that American Catholics really have always kind of been unease in a liberal society that has enshrined into law certain rights that the church has opposed. And we can see this with abortion, with the gay marriage. We can go back to taking prayer out of school. There are many, many things that the courts do that we as Catholics and teachings of our Catholic faith oppose. So we've got to be, as Catholics, we acknowledge that, and we're aware of that. So there's this uneasy tension that always exists between those laws that are passed and our Catholic faith. Now, we can see, we go back to the 19th century. We talked about Pope Leo the 13th, and, he dedicated several documents to American Catholics, pressing upon them the need to be patriotic citizens, but not succumbing to liberalism. Now, Leo called the liberalism Americanism, but much of the Catholic political writing, especially after Vatican II, has been an effort to come to terms with what it means to be a Catholic living here in America. So, regardless of what political or theological position that they took on matters, whatever they be, American Catholics developed a way with the fact that in the United States, free speech was to be granted to any and all political positions, and despite periodic outbursts of anti-Catholic prejudice, which we certainly see now, this allowed Catholics to participate fully in civic life. So that was then. As they say, this is now. Because as we round out the second decade of the 21st century, I hope it has become to you, as a practicing Catholic, increasingly clear, especially to religious conservatives, that political forces of a different kind now seek to deprive them of their free speech and rights and question their suitability to hold that public office. Now, that's a big switch. It's a big switch. Now, we see that when President Trump's presidential campaign begins to gain steam, the illiberality that long characterized the political left has grown more explicit as they increasingly target cultural conservatives and the few remaining liberals who are still left to defend the First Amendment. Now, how do they do this? What's changed so much that this is becoming so mainstream? Well, when you have a fleet of pro bono New York lawyers and Obama appointed radical judges to support them, and even along with the dishonest and even malicious press to run cover for them, you can see where a certain group of people have begun to employ bullying tactics and even violence now. And we go to this case just over this weekend with the kids, that they've been threatened. They had to have security when they opened the school today with death and violence. And one commentator, a news commentator, I don't remember her name, it's not worth really our time to even worry about her name, actually said it would be, gratifying to punch one of them in the face. This is a far cry from back in the media days when they were reporting facts and stories and not so much editorializing. But so you see these attacks on conservatives or anyone who might be mistaken for one. You may remember just a couple months ago again, I believe it was a young teenager that had one of those, like these kids did, Make America Great hats on. And some big guy, and he knew these kids weren't going to be able to do anything against him, went over there and took the hat, threw soda in his face. It was making fun of him, and then walked out. And you see this frequently. And this country, you didn't see this type of behavior before, where you've always had problems. When you've got human beings, because we're sinners, you're always going to have, conflict. You have conflict in your families, in your marriages, in your brother and sister relationships, in the business world, in politics, certainly, because that's the way this world works. It's not paradise here on earth. So until we get to heaven, we've got to deal with these things. And that's why it's important that we become aware what's going on. Now, what happened is we've always seen on the political side that political figures, Republicans, Democrats, they're targets. And yet now we've seen that this radical left movement, it sets its sights on pro-lifers at this past weekend and the March for Life. And again, we're going to use that targeting on those group of boys from Covington Catholic High School. So what we're seeing then is that dealing with the boys from Covington, while waiting for their bus, they were initially, and this is what the video originally did not show, they were harassed by members of a radical black supremacist organization called the Black Israelites, a group that believes that not only were the ancient Hebrew people, the Bible, really black Africans, but that the black race is a master race and responsible for all world civilization. And this group began to taunt the Covington Catholic boys and subjecting them, and that's what I said earlier in the show, that there was racist abuse, but it was on the other side. The boys were then approached by Nathan Phillips, as we've now learned. You might call him a professional agitator who has made a career out of initiating conflicts with white people. And while all the media, the entertainers, and sadly even some of conservative Catholics jumped on the bandwagon when this first came out, Mr. Phillips and a group of about 20 other people earlier tried to disrupt a mass at the Basilica, and they had to be locked out. So this is what we're seeing is, again, not all the facts, but just a quick jump on and being tried in the media that we live in today. And it's a very dangerous thing, and we'll get into that later. But so we see then what happened was a fabricated and heavily edited version of the one video recording the encounter quickly of Nathan Phillips and the boys. And it made the rounds on the internet and social media, while the pundits immediately went to work viciously attacking these kids. And as I said, threatening them with violence and even murder. And, this should have no place in our society, but it certainly, and we'll get into this in the show, it certainly is. And I mentioned that conservative Catholics, they quickly joined that bandwagon, calling the boys also racist. And in fact, as the evidence came forth, as time, when we had time to review everything, they were innocent and themselves were the victims of the racist abuse from Mr. Phillips and the Black Israelites. But of course, some, and I will give them credit, some of the media has admitted some wrongdoing, and not all. And that's where we'll discuss some of that problem. Because two of the most prominent Christian conservative figures who initially went after the boys, Rod Dreher, he's from Princeton University, and Robert George, also from the same university, they apologized. But as I said, others have not. And we see this, that, again, even the school jumped the gun here, assumed the worst of their own students, issued a joint press release accusing the boys of wrongdoing, simultaneously promising an investigation and further appropriate action, including possible expulsion from the school, and talk about putting the cart before the horse. And what that was about was irresponsible attempt at damage control. No question. No question. And this is where we're getting out of control, because we're going into a society and a world now with this media, and it's more than media. We'll talk about that, where we need presumption of innocence, and we're not getting it. We've seen many innocent people that have already had their reputations destroyed by these unscrupulous left-wing activists. There's just no getting around that. You know, I remember the Duke. This was several years ago. The Duke rape case, and they were guilty as all get out until a funny thing happened. The facts came out, and they were innocent as all get out. But of course, that didn't fit the narrative, did it? So it had to be held in check. So what are we to take away, really, from all of this thing? And then we'll discuss this further. But basically, there's a few points. And these are the important takeaways. We see that the left has become incredibly radicalized, now more than any time in American history. It's an extremism that is evident in their willingness to use the courts to bully critics into submission, pressure corporations to withhold advertising or services, to silence opposing viewpoints, and an increasingly call for an even, mete-out violence against conservatives in general and Christians in particular. And that's a very dangerous thing in this country. Because, you know, this is my personal opinion. I think one of the reasons that they hate President Trump so much, there's such outrage against him, more than I can imagine in my lifetime that I've seen against any president. And I believe if we look at this, we can see that it wasn't so much policies that have changed our country and an outlook on our country, but laws that we created in courts and judges that weren't there to follow the constitutional law and the precedents of law, but to impart their particular political agenda upon the people and with the power that they have. And we've seen the changes. You know, the Supreme Court does some good things, but if you look at their history, and I don't have time on the show to go down. I'll just mention a couple quick ones, but they have made some really disturbing decisions that have affected Americans dramatically. One of the ones, if you can check this out, is the Dred Scott decision, which opened the door to the Civil War. We see taking prayer out of school. In 1973, the abortion, which is such a hot topic, and I'm going to talk a little about that tonight because of what happened with New York and Governor Cuomo, a supposed Catholic. Now, when I say things like this, I'm not judging Mauro Cuomo, soul, or any Catholic or person that believes in abortion. I don't know the state of their soul and why they do things. That's up to God. I've said that many times on this show. I have enough sin and trouble in my own life to worry about my own salvation, much less someone else's, which I am concerned, of course. But I don't know where they're going because I don't know what's in people's hearts. Only God knows. But when you see a Catholic in the public square that has political power as a governor, and they signed the most pro-abortion law that you can kill a baby now, and I mean that word. I mean that word. Right up until its birth now in New York. And that should be a cause for alarm to all people. To all people. And this is where we're getting. And these are people that that believe in God, that have a faith, but don't see that their faith is supposed to permeate everything they do. And we live in a culture, as St. John Paul II said, a culture of death and not a culture of life. And it is a culture of life which Jesus wants. Because to follow Jesus means to transform. He asks us, we talked about this last week, that it's pretty simple, that Jesus wants us to follow him and do the things that he does. And that's to give dignity to life, to the marginalized. Right? Jesus' mission is in Luke chapter 4, 16 to 19. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. I have been anointed by God to preach the gospel to the poor, to bring liberty to the captives, to free the oppressed, and to have a year of favor in the Lord, and to give sight to the blind. So Jesus wants us to love one another as he has loved us, and to do unto others. Because that's the genius of God, is that, yes, we are individuals, but we also are social, and we need each other. Do unto others in Scripture is right there. And we need each other to live, because this moral life that we're asked as followers of Christ is basically to live a life of love. And that love constitutes being concerned with life and the gift of life from all ages, from the womb to the elderly at the end of their lives, and those sacred spots. And that way the middlemen that are in between are also given the respect and dignity that Christ gives to us, because we are made in the image of him who created us. You see, that's what this is about. It's about forgiveness and freedom, because Christ sets us free. And this is the God we want to follow and emulate, and to make visible the invisible God in the visible world by our actions. And yet, when we make these laws, when we go against, and if you're Catholic, the Church's teachings, and what Christ wants as a follower of Christ, what then? Well, we become our own God. We determine what's right or wrong. We determine who lives and dies. We determine who is a useful cog in society and who is not. And this is a very dangerous slope for human beings to be on, because we've done this before. We've walked this road before. And yet we don't learn. As human beings collectively, we look down upon other cultures that have lived before us, that have done great things. And we have built upon them. And yet we look down upon them for the most part. And we think we are better and smarter and more enlightened than they are. And yet, because we do not know history, and we, worse, aren't willing to learn it, we will repeat those same mistakes. And we're seeing it play out now. This is nothing new in other cultures. Nothing new at all. This has happened before to us. It has recently happened just 60 years ago in World War II, where through the radio and the media, the Fuhrer was able to turn the heat upon the Jewish people and come up with his final solution. And that's how it started. And he got the people to go along with him. And it wasn't an overnight thing or an overnight sensation that it just happened. But it was more like a drip by drip by drip. Just what's happening now. And I'm not comparing the United States right now to Nazi Germany. But what I'm saying is people are people. And it doesn't matter what area of this globe you're on or what your nationality or your race is. We are all human beings. We're all connected. And together, we need to dialogue to build this culture of life. So to get back to New York, when you have people of faith that are going against what their faith teaches as an intrinsic evil and making law, not just a law now supposedly to protect women's health. If you read that law, this doesn't protect women's health. Matter of fact, if they want to go to what they call a back alley abortion, those people now are protected. If anything goes wrong and the baby or woman, I believe, die, at least in the baby's case, they cannot be legally held responsible. And this is absurd, especially as, again, I mentioned that these the children now, the abortions can take place right up to birth. And that should be pretty scary for us. So this is what we're up against in this country. So this is what I mean. When we don't choose God's law, there was going to be a vacuum created. And we've seen this before. I mentioned Nazi Germany. There was the Stalinist Russia, Mao's China, Castro's Cuba. A vacuum, because we need something to be loyal to, will that vacuum that was created by the absence of God, and because we need loyalty, will be created by us and our systems. And we've seen these systems, whether it's socialism, communism, and even now ruthless capitalism. If it's not done with any moral ground behind it, it's going to be devastating. And time will tell on that, whether we come back. So to get back where we originally started now, so we see this extremism and the willingness of the courts to do this. Because again, President Trump is now in the process of changing the court system. And I believe that's where the particular people in power with a particular agenda, they hate him so much, because that agenda can be changed now in the same way that they gained it. And we see now that even Catholic youth, remember, kids were kind of off base in the adult world in our wars. But the Catholic youth now are no longer immune to this hatred. And they will certainly not be spared if they're pro-life or they're civil. We've seen now, and we should have seen this since President Trump got elected, whether you like him or not, whether you're voting for him or not, that the mainstream media will expend every ounce of its energy to lie and defame conservative Christians until there is accountability on their part. And that's one of the dangers we have right now. There is no accountability unless you're on the other side. So that's a very bad place for us to be, because you can have a lot of trouble when only one side is able to push and the other side has no grounds to defend themselves. And even in our church, the Catholic bishops and some of the certain church officials give the media too much credibility and accepting uncritically biased and unverified press narratives, even if it's against the church. So we've got to be very, very concerned about these things happening. And we just can't, kind of distance ourselves and, well, the Lord's going to take care of all this, which He will, and not do our part. Because with the rise of public incivility and the conflict, this is reminiscent, if you look at it, of the civil unrest in the 60s and 70s. And it's now time, I believe, for Catholics to fully comprehend the nature of the threat, organize their own defense, assert our civil liberties, and fight back. Because you can only push people so much before that happens. So it's not a good place for us to be, because anytime you have this kind of conflict, our country, and I'm not saying you're going to have a civil war now, of course, but when you have this kind of conflict, our country has already had one civil war, and civil wars, whether they be the Spanish Civil War, wherever they take place, they are disastrous. There's a great deal of carnage, and we don't want to go there. And there's still plenty of time for unity and dialogue. But I said I didn't want to blame the media for all these problems. They're part of the problem. So is the political realm part of the problem. Because we see this desire for power on both sides that take place above the American people. So many things could have been done in the last couple of years for the benefit of people. And because of the tug and war and the power and no dialogue and no compromise, we're seeing just people shoved under the rug with no concern at all about the so-called average American man and woman and child. And those are the losers here. Because, the wealthy and the people in power, they are insulated from many, many, many things that you and I are not. And they know it. And they're pretty well set, and so are their families pretty well set. And, sometimes the old thing, with the wealthy is the more money they make, some of that cream off the top, we're all picked up in this rise, rise of the floodwater, if you will. And you wonder sometimes if that's true. I think I mentioned on the show, one of the shows there, I don't remember what we did it on, but I think it was in the Roman times that 1% of the wealthy Romans owned 60% of the wealth. And now, in our time, it's 1% of that own 40% of the wealth. That's not really good odds for the rest of us that are left, because, the odds are we're not going to be too kind. There's just not that much to go around. And the sad thing is that God has allowed us as human beings with our free will. We have the capacity to change all this. I mean, it's incredible that so many people starve today when so many have so much. And really, sometimes we've got to question this. We should anyway. We should think about these things, because when we're distracted, and there are many distractions today, we don't have time to sit and think about that and helping out our fellow man. And that's what really is the key to life. I mentioned a few moments ago that the genius of God is that He created community, that we need to help each other out. Because you and I are not only responsible for ourselves, but also for others and the world. And certainly that includes creation. When we exploit and don't take care of creation, we're going to pay a price. There's no getting around that, because we're all connected. We're not detached. Even though I believe now in society, because we didn't live like cultures before that were close to the land, we do feel we are detached from it, but we really aren't. We really aren't. Just look at how much weather affects us. It has a dramatic effect on people. But to get back, we've got to see, too, that it's not just the media, but we see universities that are spewing out a certain agenda that isn't really one of dialogue, but one that is, diametrically opposed through any means to obtain what you want, and the means justify an end. And this is not, again, a good place for us to be as Americans or in the world in general. One of the things I think we have a tough time with the new generations that came up is that life isn't fair. I think many of us that are older certainly know that, or I would hope we would know that. And that you can't have everything and don't get everything you want in life. We've had dreams, and some we've accomplished. We've had goals, and some we've accomplished. And so they may be some of the bigger dreams and goals that we had in our life and didn't happen. And we had to live, move on, suck it up, and go on and do the best with what we could. And it seems at part that today many people don't want to believe that. and that it's going to be their way or the highway, and that's just it. And that, again, is an unrealistic way to look at life. And that's the thing. We went from being, from humankind looking at the natural law, which the church always promoted, because the church has always said that, natural law, it comes from the divine, eternal. So that's where it derives from. And it is knowable through human reason to live a good life and create a good society. So the church has always used that. And natural law then has some requirements that we have to, as human beings, follow in order to have a good society. So the truths then, there are moral truths in essence that are knowable. And that means that there are certain things that are undeniable, like murder and rape and things like this, that we know you can't get around. And yet, what happened is that the natural law in the early 19th century took a hit, because when Darwin came up with his theory of evolution, you could see where this began to be used by groups of people and the survival of the fittest to say that one race was superior to another. And it led to the biggest carnage we've had so far in World War II. So it kind of took a hit, because when that happened, when that was over, it was like, wow, maybe we don't want to stay here in this natural law. Maybe we need something new. But what happened then, and this is the opposition that came as a result of that, and natural law taking that hit, was you have relativism now, which, Pope Benedict at that time was Cardinal Ratzinger worried about, because relativism is that my morality is mine and yours is yours. And that led to subjectivism, where now my truth is my truth and yours is yours. And now those two led to what we see very heavily now in our society, skepticism. There is no absolute truth. And that's a tough triple play, because these things are not true. There is an absolute moral truth, and there is truth. And there are things as a society and community, because we are connected, that we have to acknowledge and live together and agree upon. And there can't be your truth is your truth, and your morality is my morality. And we're seeing that now. Unfortunately, I mentioned the courts being forced upon people, or you pay the price. And these are the dangers when we get away from that natural law and with the teachings of our faith based on Jesus Christ. We will have a high price to pay. And there should be no doubt that there is definitely an agenda to take away what are very, in our country at least, what were pretty simple, basic American beliefs in how we lived, how we behaved, what the norm was, and we don't see that anymore. We don't see that anymore. There usually are three rules for norms, and one is what they call method, in that the method is, what am I going to do in this situation? The next part of that, the second part, is the principle. What is the principle that's going to guide me to choose what I will or won't do? And then the third part of that is the guide. What's guiding me to choose to do what I will or won't do? And you don't see this playing out anymore for the most part. That there is, again, that relativism and subjectivism and skepticism that don't take that into account. And what's worse, if people are basing their particular morality, which they believe is only theirs, or the particular truth which is only theirs, on a soundbite or an entertainer or someone that really they think has great credibility, but really in essence doesn't have any more than they do, you're going to, again, have trouble. Because, again, some moral truths are knowable, and we're trying to push that away. You know, a couple of things happened. I noticed this week that there was another that kind of disturbed me a little. Notre Dame forced to, well, maybe force wasn't the right word. Maybe they chose to, in the political correct atmosphere we live in, to cover up things resembling Christopher Columbus because it was offensive to Native Americans. And then the other was, again, a continuation of the statues of the Confederacy that are being taken down. Now, it all, to many people, I'm sure, seems trivial. You know, what's the big deal? It offends some people. You know, there was some grave injustice. Certainly slavery is an injustice. The country went to war, that civil war we mentioned a moment ago, to end that. So there are things done by people that aren't good. Now, last week we mentioned something called the double factor of proportionality, where even if you do something good, there may be an indirect evil. I use the example of a mother who will die if the baby isn't aborted. And there, while you're saving a life, you're also taking a life, which wasn't the main intention, but there's an indirect evil there. And that's what happens in many cases with our dealings because we're human beings. We try, but there's always room for improvement. We make mistakes, and some are disastrous, catastrophic. So the point, what I'm trying to make, is that there are moments in American history and in all history of all peoples where there are things that you're not, as a people, proud of. But it doesn't change the fact that's part of the history and the makeup of that particular country or people. And that can't be covered up and shouldn't be taken away because we're good or bad. And, you know, whether it was good or evil, it's part of that history, part of the story, just like our family stories. Our families aren't perfect. There's some good stories and there's some not so good stories. But it doesn't change the fact that in our particular family, that is the story of our family. And to just take out that Uncle Joe or Uncle Jim or Aunt Susie was this, that, and that, we don't talk about them anymore because it's going to put a stain on all of us that are so good. That's not good. That's not a good thing. Certain things are done. What the people did in the Manifest Destiny in the United States to take away the Indians' land wasn't right. Wasn't right. Terrible thing. But it's unfortunately part of history, as the Confederacy, as slavery, as some of the other things that were done, as some of the, the Tammany Hall things in politics, and the games that resided in those early days in the political realm in Boston and New York. So there's a lot of things not to be proud of, but on the other hand, there's a lot of things to be proud of. But it's a mixed bag, and you've got to take both the good and the bad. And, one of the things that people do throughout war when they conquered other people was to take their culture away. Now, I'm Polish, and Poland wasn't even a country for hundreds of years. They were partitioned. They weren't even on a world map at one time. Divided and played for sport by people more powerful. And that's part of our history and not a good part. And, You know, what the Nazis did to the Poles was atrocious. And when the Russians came in, they thought, oh my gosh, how happy we are. And they were worse. They did more atrocities than the Nazis did. And that's part of the history. And what the Nazis and what the Russians did was to take away the Polish culture. Not talk about Polish heroes or the military men, the Polish food, the music, the dancing, the theater, the stories, and the history. Had to go. The statues of the famous Polish leaders had to go. The books had to go. Now that was an extreme case, but you know, you don't have to do it extreme. Remember what I mentioned about Nazi Germany, drip by drip. It didn't happen overnight. And while that's what I meant when it all seems no big deal, it becomes a big deal. Because sometimes, for us as human beings, we have to remember our past to know who we are and who we are to become. And when we get rid of that past, we're just floating. We're just floating. And we'll grab onto anything to have an identity. Because as human beings, we need to have love, we need to be accepted, and we need to be nurtured. We need to have support because we have challenges, and we need that support to help us in our challenges. And maybe the most important thing outside of love is that we need to have purpose in life. And when all that's taken away, and your dignity as a human being is stripped away, and you're marginalized, and you're expendable, and your worth is just what you produce for society, to this unknown entity, we're in a very dangerous place as human beings because we've been there before. And that's why I mentioned that it's so disturbing that history is being changed, and in some cases not even taught. You know, one of the things I find one of my pet peeves is in this political correctness and a nod to the feminists, we can't call the founding fathers fathers because that's a male term. It's patriarchal. And some might find that offensive, especially if they've had a poor father figure. So we changed the word to framers. And again, it doesn't seem like it's a big deal, but it is. Because these were men. These were men that drafted this Constitution and Declaration of Independence. And you know, the knock on the Founding Fathers now in revisionist history, we've talked about that really quickly, is that's where we change history to fit the mentality and the needs of our particular time to bend to what we believe. The problem with that is that that's not what those people believe because they did not live in the epoch of the time that we are. And believe me, if the Founding Fathers saw what was happening now, they would be appalled. And many of the people that came out of depression and fought in World War II would be appalled. And this is where we're at, and this is the danger of changing all this. And that's why I say it sounds trivial, but it's really not. Because you have to know the past and where you came from in order to grow. You know, sometimes progress for the sake of progress for human beings isn't a good thing. You know, I mentioned technology. Technology does some wonderful things. It's amazing, especially in the medical field, what's happening. But, you know, for every one good technological thing we do, there may be 10 more problems that come with that have to be also figured out. And that also includes the problems once you figure that out, that will be included in that. So it's a very tricky thing. But this political correctness, especially when it comes to history, is going to be harmful because we don't learn, as I mentioned earlier, from the mistakes that other people have made. You see this conflict in this head-to-head confrontation for power with no dialogue, and the middlemen you and I, being left out really in the discussion. And a tug of war where we're just being used as a rope to get what the people in power want. Because, it's a funny thing through history. And, we just celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday. That when you look at Martin Luther King and his legacy in the civil rights movement, what he did was a nonviolent approach to initiate dialogue between those who wanted segregation and those who wanted their freedom. And by going against an unjust law at the time to get a higher moral law, he got the sides to come together and acknowledge that there was something wrong to change things. And that actually started changing when the police no longer turned those hoses on Easter Sunday on the demonstrators. So things begin to change because they begin to look at themselves. Because when you have a bigger issue, and that's what you have in what they call morality, transitive and intransitive. Transitive is how it affects the world. So in this case with Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement and how it changed things, and rightfully so. And yet he was changed, and those police officers were changed. And that's the intransitive, because you cannot look out a major thing in the world that you're trying to change without being changed yourself in a moral way. And that's why it's important to know the past and to know your history so you can do those things. And that's the right approach when you want to enact real and meaningful change for the benefit of all, not a few. And the point I was getting at, you will find in our history as human beings that those that are in power will not freely relinquish any of their power. And here I use Martin Luther King's case. They had no intention until a peaceful protest, which led to their arrest, but led to the world being aware of what was going on and that there had to be something done to lift everybody up and that dialogue begin to be discussed. And that's what we need to do today. We need to have that type of thing. And you don't see the protests. We mentioned, we started at the show with the Covington School and what happened in Washington at the pro-life march. And that's where we're at now. And that's just the latest incident. There will be more. There will be more. And if something isn't done, it will probably escalate into something much worse. And I hope that's not what it takes to get people to come to the table to work out solutions, because that means innocent people and even not so innocent people that initiate this are going to pay the price. So are we at a crossroads in the country? Probably, because we need to do something. We can't keep going on like this. And that means all of us have to change. It means the media has to change. It means the entertainment industry has to change. It means the universities and the education system has to change. And it means the political system. That has to change. And I don't mean a new concept. I don't mean a new, like a socialism or a communism, or go back to one of the tried and true ways that everybody would be equal. But a way in which we work within the system that we have that has given so much and freedom to this country so that everybody is pulled up. And those that don't have can have some of this. And maybe those that have so much can give a little bit. And we can work this so that we can have some peace and some unity and get peace back in our hearts individually and in our families, in our society. Because we've mentioned this on the show several times, that it's all about the supernatural battle. And God is a God of unity and a God of peace and love. And Satan, he's one of disunity and hatred and no peace. And that's what's going on right now, is that we have all this division and there's this unity. And make no mistake about it, it is good versus evil. You know, I mentioned last week that one of the things that we as human beings need is to hang on to hope. That while there's hope, it's always a good thing. Always, that's what we need. And, you know, I use the Old Testament and the plagues that were sent upon Egypt, when for the Jewish people, with Egypt in the power, you know, it looked like their freedom, their slavery was just inevitable, that it was for them an invincible evil, and it could not be overcome, and yet it was. God heard their cries, and he delivered them and gave them their freedom. And of course, we know as human beings what happened after that. We took it for granted, and we turned away from God and had to be corrected again by God. And back to the blessing, and back to the curse. Back to the blessing, back to the curse. So not much has changed. We still do the same things. You know, this country was based on those Judeo-Christian principles by those founding fathers that initiated this, and we have broken away from that. This country has now passed laws that says, God, we really don't need you. We can do this ourselves. We decide what's right and wrong for us. We decide what's important in our lives. Doggone it, we can decide what life is itself. And you even have people talking now that we are so advanced with our technology that maybe we can solve the problem, you know, of death. Well, even if you did that from a point of sickness or health, it still doesn't stop natural disasters, still doesn't stop murders, war, getting hit by a truck when you're walking the street, automobile accidents, plane, can't do it. And yet we have this naive belief that we're going to create a utopia here because we're so smart. That's a lot of hubris. And it's going to go against God's plan. Our home here isn't the earth. And while life is a great gift and most people cherish and love it, our true home is eternity. And we've taken, for the most part, our eye off that. You know, we see this in these statements where he who gets all the toys at the end wins, which really doesn't mean anything, because I'm sure you've been to many funerals, and unfortunately, and no one takes it with them, no matter what. No matter what they have, it's not going with them. They are alive somewhere, but their stuff didn't go with them. So actually, that's kind of a false statement, because it's who we have become in God's eyes and what we've done for the least of his children that determine whether our lives were successful or not. And that gets us to embrace him in eternity by trying to live a good faith and relying on his mercy and the great gift that he won for us, because it's nothing we could do. We can't earn our way to heaven. It's a gift, free gift from him. And yet, like any gift, we don't have to take it. That's free will. We can accept it, or we may not accept it. And we pray that we do. We pray that we do. Because as St. Paul said, we are all guilty, and through Christ we are all acquitted. And that is the good news of the gospel, that he freed us. But that comes with responsibility too, that we need to clean up our act a little bit and try to help those that don't have as much as we do. So again, you know, we'll leave you with the thought, we don't want to go negative, because we have the Christian joy and hope that, again, no matter how bleak things are, no matter how much evil seems invincible, God and good will always triumph. And that's our Christian hope. But we can't bury our heads in the sand. We have to do our part. And with these attacks that are so frequent upon Catholics, it's probably time that we started to use our power as Catholics and our faith in God and the means that we have to stand up for our God and our faith. And that's faith in action when the rubber hits the road. But just remember that there was a kid named David once that went against that time an invincible warrior, Goliath, and through God, he triumphed. And so will we. And with that, I wish you all a good night, and God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.